Welcome everybody to the Royal Institute of Philosophy Public Lectures. Thank you right at the start for making it today. Such a lovely day outside when you could have gone for a walk. But I'm so glad that you weren't in two minds and you decided to come here. Yeah. So I have the pleasure of introducing a very dear friend, philosopher, Dr. Kevin McGill, who I have known since 1992. He started teaching in this university, I think, a year before me in 1991.
1990.
1990.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. And we've taught together in the same department for many years. And thanks to Kevin, actually, we got the opportunity to organize the Royal Institute of Philosophy Lectures from 2003, because Kevin is a member of the executive of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and he rooted for us. And since then, we've organized more than 40 lectures. I thought it's high time we should say thank you to Kevin and have a chance to listen to what he has been doing since he left university. So Kevin was a senior lecturer in philosophy for several years and progressed to become an associate dean. So he was my line manager at one time, Kevin. And then he decided to leave. To pursue philosophy in his own time and to think about some really hard subjects in philosophy. One of them being, what is the connection between having freedom, which we all want to have, and being determined in some way? So being a materialist, it was a really difficult question. It is a difficult question in philosophy. And his first book, which is Freedom and Experience, Self-Determination Without Illusion, deals with that. Since then, Kevin has gone on to talk about some strange topics, I should say, like being in two places at the same time, and also something about machine desires. Now, I don't know anything about it, I must say, and I need to know a little bit more from Kevin. I don't know if you'll mention it today, but today Kevin is going to speak about kinds of minds. He has been quite enamored, I think, by a particular text, which I'm sure he will mention because I've heard him talk about it before, and enlighten us about what he has managed to get out of this several years of thinking very deeply about this very hard question in philosophy. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Mina. Thanks, everybody. I don't know that kinds of minds is absolutely the best, most illustrative title for the talk. Actually, I almost wish I'd chosen to do, is it possible to experience being in two places at one time? Because that's quite a fun paper. Whereas what I'm talking about tonight is kind of trying to draw some themes out of the main research I'm working on at the moment. I am still attached to the university. I'm an honorary research fellow in philosophy, which gets me a library card. So, kinds of minds could mean all kinds of things. Could refer to neurodiversity, psychological categories, that kind of thing. I will weave it in and out, but what I want to look at in terms of kinds of minds is what's claimed to have been a major transformation in human minds, in what Julian Jaynes calls human mentality, that occurred, it's claimed, in the 1st century BC, round about 600 or 700 years BC, when, according to several thinkers, self-consciousness made its first appearance in human minds. You might think that self-consciousness is kind of natural property. You can be aware of yourself just as much as anything else. But no, according to these thinkers, prior to, as I say, about 3,000 years ago, people didn't really have self-conscious thoughts. But I'll come on to that. What led me to be kind of interested in this particular claim is my main research interest at the moment, which I've given a couple of talks about before, a short one here a few years ago, a much elaborated one to the Wolverhampton Philosophy Society. And I want to try and avoid repeating, what I said in those papers, but nevertheless, I'll have to cover some of the key points again, otherwise you wouldn't know why I was interested in this supposed shift in human mentality that allegedly occurred in the first millennia BC. So my main research interest is at the moment, the meaning and significance of hearing voices, inner voices. So the kinds of inner voices that people very often associate with conditions like schizophrenia, that some hearers of voices associate with the divine, with God, sometimes with devils, and so on and so forth. I started thinking about that just listening to a radio program one night in which people were talking about experiences of, as it were, communing with what those people took to be the divine, with God. In some cases, it was a kind of silent communication. In some cases, things were said. But it seemed, in all of the reports of these examples of hearing voices in this radio program, that they were very transformative and positive and powerful. So, for me, as what you might call a secular rationalist, someone who stopped believing in any kind of creator God a long, long time ago, someone who doesn't believe in life after death, I thought to myself, well, could I consider, the possibility that actually somebody hearing voices, that for them, has a profound effect, a good effect, a supportive effect. Could I actually consider that as a non-believer myself to be a good thing? And another question that occurred to me was, well, does everybody perhaps have the capacity to hear inner voices? And at the time, I was an associate dean, and I didn't get much time to write, so I just kind of scribbled these ideas down. And after I'd as Mina said, retired from the university, there was a conference here, and I wrote these up into a little paper, putting those questions. And that's kind of what led me on to this issue of the birth of self-conscious, the claimed birth of self-conscious in the first millennia BC. Because this is one of the major subjects of a book which Mina mentioned before by Julian Jaynes called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. There's nothing new, I should say, about the idea of big changes in consciousness and so on and so forth in history. I mean, up until fairly recently, anthropologists and various others would talk about the savage mind as compared to the modern enlightened, rational, logical mind. The claim that self-conscious, a kind of self-conscious mentality began to emerge around the 6th and 7th century BC isn't like that. It's not a claim about people's limitations, or intellectual abilities. It is a claim that at that time, there came about significant changes in the way people thought, or at any rate at that point, the way people thought at certain points in ancient Greece. So, at that point, supposedly, if you look at the available historical material, songs, poems, writings, and so forth, you find for the first time sort of references to things like minds and souls and inner feelings and inner life. Self-consciousness, apparently. Well, one thing to mention about self-consciousness, just to begin with, is it's not a very specific term. It can mean all sorts of things in all sorts of different contexts. You know, an insect, for example, to the extent that you know it knows not to eat itself, to run away, it can make a distinction between itself, what it can do, and what other things can do. You could say is in a way self-conscious, and there are a range of ways that people might be said, animals as well might be said to be self-conscious, just being, you know, aware of you know, their own bodies, let's say. The kind of or the notion of self-consciousness that scholars who claim that it arose historically in ancient Greece are talking about is the kind that's exemplified in the surviving fragments of poets and songwriters of the time, particularly and notably the poet Sappho. There's one fragment from Sappho's poetry in which she describes a scene in which the woman that she loves, that she desires, is basically given the eye to some man. And she describes the effect on her feelings, on herself, of seeing that. Apparently, nothing like that had been seen in poetry and stories much prior to that. They talk, you know, loads of stories about journeys and battles and encounters and so forth, but no reference to inner feelings and thoughts, and you know, no real reference to, you know, or idea of the self as a thinker of thoughts and a feelings before that time. One thing just about that Sappho example is that the self-conscious that's being talked about is a consciousness of our own feelings, of our own inner world, and that's very often what's meant by self-consciousness. It doesn't necessarily mention anything about the awareness of the other two people in the example of Sappho and how she might feel about that, which is another notion of self-consciousness. So loads of notions of self-consciousness, which I'm not going to resolve tonight. All I want to say really is there is a claim that self-consciousness of the sort exemplified in the writings of Sappho and other you know, lyric and love poets of that time in Greece show the emergence of a kind of, well, a vocabulary, a new vocabulary, a new way of talking, of minds, of souls, of feelings, of thoughts, of thinking, of being able to think about those things going on in other people's minds as well. You don't find that in the literature prior to that time. So this would have been, quite a major change in the thinking of the people who expressed that. This brings me on. You won't, for example, find any of the characters in the Iliad, which was originally a collection of oral stories from the second millennia BC. You won't find any of the characters in that, certainly the human characters, referring to their feelings or thoughts or what they think they're going to do about this or that. They're just not described in that way. There's no notion of self-consciousness in there. So, to come on to Julian Jaynes. Julian Jaynes is one of several scholars who makes this claim about self-consciousness emerging around that time. Julian Jaynes is striking because, unlike several of the other scholars, he gives an account of what he thought the kind of mentality was that existed prior to self-consciousness. Now, I guess a lot of, some of the people, who studied the emergence of self-consciousness might not have thought it, such a big deal, just a step forward in the human ability to, express ourselves. Jaynes, however, thought of self-consciousness as a completely new way of thinking, replacing a quite different kind of mentality, which, according to him, had existed prior to the first millennia BC, and certainly in the third millennia BC and before that. And it's what he calls the bicameral mind. According to Julian Jaynes, before self-consciousness came along, no one had thoughts about themselves or their inner feelings and so on and so forth. And nobody really, according to him, took decisions. In fact, the structure of human mentality, according to Jaynes, was like this. There was a hearer and a speaker. And, life, routine life, that could be gotten on with normally. But when people encountered new situations or were caused stress in any way, the voice would speak and tell them what to do. And you won't be surprised to know that, in Jaynes's account, that voice eventually becomes to be thought of as, the voice of gods or the god and so on and so forth. It's a pretty bizarre idea, but you can see why I was drawn to it, interested in the idea of hearing inner voices, to a writer who claimed that at one time the whole of humanity heard inner voices. He didn't think that they knew that there were inner voices. They thought that they were the voices of gods. They thought they were being talked to by idols, according to Jaynes. Now, he may be right, he may be wrong, but if you read the book, and I'd certainly recommend it, if it were wrong from beginning to end, it would still be a spellbinding read, in my opinion. The Origins of Consciousness. But the use he makes of the evidence, the case he makes for this very different kind of mentality in the past, is very convincing indeed. Is, for example, quite critical of previous historians' treatment of paintings from ancient Assyria and Egypt and hieroglyphics and so on and so forth, where a god is featured in those things. Because, said, oh yeah, if, in writings, scholars would say, well, the people said that the god spoke to them and said, well, what they mean by that is, it's a kind of representation of what they think the God is saying to them. And Jane says, well, nobody ever talks about representations of God saying things to them in these writings. Nobody talks about representations of idols talking to them. They actually say, the idol told me to do this. The idol told us to take it to the river, to wash it, to put things in its mouth. And there are several examples of people writing in this way, as if idols and unseen presences were speaking to them. And James concludes from this that they were in fact hearing those things. They were subject to what psychologists call auditory verbal hallucinations. So, there are certainly arguments one can put against James's claims. His account of how this inner voice first came about, for example, he thinks that it might have happened when people started to work at the behest of supervisors. So to stop themselves wandering off from their work, they would just repeat the words that they were told over and over again, and that gradually became a voice. That doesn't seem to me a very plausible account of how that would have come about. I can think of a better one. I'm not going to go into it now. But as I say, there are certainly a lot of questions about the kinds of claims James makes. But where he seems to be on the most solid ground is in interpreting the evidence that he thinks there is for the existence of this previous non-conscious mentality, this divided mentality between, as I say, an inner hearer and an inner speaker and a hearer. The hearer being just the ordinary person who did the jobs and so on and so forth. Now, James's idea that at one time, all human beings had heard voices really started to make me, think about my initial ideas about people who hear voices now. And a third question that I put in the first paper I gave here about it was, well, suppose somebody regularly hears and responds to a voice within. But although she hears and believes that the voice is speaking to her, and doesn't believe it's coming from outside her head. And I should mention, there are actually large voice-hearing movements in existence now. And as far as I know, most of the people that have been interviewed in them, have spoken at the meetings, have contributed to the journals and so on and so forth. Most of them don't think that the voices are coming from outside of their heads, as the ancient bicamerals might, according to James. So I put the question, so say somebody doesn't believe that the voice that they're hearing is coming from anywhere outside of their own heads. Should they believe that it's really themselves talking to themselves, or could it be rational for such a person to think of the voice that's speaking to them as other than them, right? So a voice from within your head speaking to you, but not you speaking to yourself. That was the kind of third question I put in that paper. I doubt whether that question has ever been considered in psychological theories or therapies in relation to voice hearing. So I come on to that now. And really this is a main thrust of my research on hearing voices, because it's largely psychologists who are interested in voice hearing, and they have quite a range of theories about how voice hearing happens, what causes it, what the mechanisms are, and so on and so forth. A lot of the evidence that's been amassed in psychology and psychiatry regarding voice hearing, unfortunately, is associated with conditions like schizophrenia, and that's kind of what you'd expect, because most people think of, well, if someone's hearing voices, that's a symptom of schizophrenia or a similar condition. In fact, when I checked the CIA World Fact Book, it records, I think, about 250,000 diagnosed cases of schizophrenia in this country. There's been no really absolutely systematic survey of voice hearing among the population at large. But there have been some surveys and questionnaires and so forth over the years. In fact, over 150 years, really. And the lowest estimates from those sort of questions and surveys and studies of the percentage of people they talked to who heard voices was something like 9%. In some of them, it was up to 40%. Now that suggests an awful lot more people hear voices than you'd think, and an awful lot more people than are diagnosed with or need be suspected of schizophrenia. Psychology has several notions about how voice hearing is caused in the first place. So there's the association with schizophrenia. Another one is the remembering of vivid memories and not being able to sort of realise that the voice that you're remembering is just a memory. That's another explanation. I suppose the dominant explanation of how voice hearing gets going at the moment would be as a result of trauma, and particularly child abuse, as you'd expect, because that's an explanation for an awful lot of things in psychology at the moment. Whatever the theories are, and whatever the therapeutic approach is taken, they all assume, more or less, that what's going on when people hear voices is that they're really talking to themselves without realising it. That they're kind of, they're talking to themselves in their heads without realising it. And coming back to my third question was, well, could it be that a voice that's coming from within your head, is actually something other than you, other than yourself? psychologists, whatever the theories, whatever the approach, seem to be pretty unanimous that it's always the voice hearer really talking to themselves, but because of some disorder, or mechanism or experience, they don't experience it in that way. I've got a number of arguments with that assumption. For example, ordinarily, that when you're speaking, you know what you're saying without having to listen to it. That wouldn't be a knockdown argument. I just give it as an example of one of my arguments, that the assumption that when anybody ever hears voices inside their heads, it's really themselves talking to themselves, is an assumption that needs more support than it currently has. It is simply an assumption. So, and in fact, it's recognised to a certain extent as a problem in psychology. So, at one time, 50 years ago, or even more recently, if you went to the doctor and said, I'm a bit bothered that I'm hearing voices, you would very likely be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and certainly you would be investigated further for it. But over time, in psychology, that attitude is modified. And in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a volume that first came out after the Second World War to help American psychiatrists deal with people who suffered psychological trauma during that period. In the 2000 edition, the claim is now made that, as I say, what are called audio-visual hallucinations are only symptomatic of schizophrenia if accompanied by other symptoms. I'm sorry, Alan, could you get me some more water? Now, as Simon McCarthy-Jones, in his kind of magisterial book on hearing, on the history of treatments of hearing voices and theories of hearing voices and therapeutic approaches, comments on that claim, well, look, if these kinds of audio-visual hallucinations need to be accompanied by some other kind of dysfunction before they're considered to be pathological, before they're considered to be some kind of illness, well, you could have one person hearing voices but with no other psychological impairment. Another person hearing the same kinds of voices but with some other kind of psychological dysfunction. The first person their voice hearing wouldn't be considered to be pathological. The second person would. And McCarthy-Jones says, well, that's inconsistent, seemingly. And this is an issue that psychology, I think, is a long way from resolving. I looked at a paper published just last year by some therapists on approaches to voice hearing, the causes of it. And it was perfectly clear that it was still considered by them to be a pathology. So although I think in response to voice hearers who say, I get on perfectly well with my voice, you know, they give me good advice. And my voice, you know, it gives me company and so on and so forth. Psychologists, you know, and therapists have had to take account of that and say, well, okay, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing if it's helping some people. Maybe it's not a pathology. Still, the view taken within psychotherapy is that, well, ideally, if somebody's hearing voices, what needs to be done is to find a way to get them gradually to realise that it's them talking to themselves. And eventually, as that happens, you know, the voices will cease. If that can't be done, if the person continues to hear the voice, well, you know, ideally, if they can at least understand that somehow it's themselves speaking to themselves, you know, that would be the thing to aim for. To come back to it, nobody considers the question, well, does it have to be themselves talking to themselves? Because if it were just, let's say, another part of their brain talking to themselves, then a therapy that tried to gradually get you to take on board the idea that your inner voice is just you talking to yourself could be quite damaging. As it goes, I think there are, and the evidence is that there are, you know, very different kinds of voice hearing. I have a friend, for example, who hears her son, who lives about 100 miles away, occasionally say, mother, you know, every so many months. There's no message in that. I don't know what causes it. But some people, on the other hand, do hear voices that speak to them, sometimes that reassure them. Some people hear voices that are a lot less than reassuring, those voices particularly associated with conditions such as schizophrenia. My argument really is that the possibility that some voice hearing in which, you know, it appears to the person that somebody is saying something to them that they're not saying to themselves, giving them advice, that actually could represent a kind of a separate presence, a separate intelligence, a separate area, you know, of the brain, is a possibility that really ought to be investigated. I see no reason for assuming that it shouldn't be, and that it. How can I put this? Yeah, that it shouldn't be assumed that a voice coming from within the brain is always you talking. So that's basically my argument with the psychologists over that. So pursuing this idea, trying to sort of think through this idea that there might be, you know, a part of people's brains, of some people's brains, that speak to them, that give them advice. Possibly that such a possibility might exist in any brains. Pursuing that idea, it did really start to change the way that I thought about mind, certainly, about the questions I asked, about the way, the kind of thing that I think of mind as being, I suppose. What you might think, to come back to my title, about kinds of minds, is that to be, reflected by, what your particular interests are. So, medicine, will classify kinds of minds into healthy, and then, a range of mind dysfunctions. Ethologists, people who study animal behaviour, will have a different set of classification of kinds of minds. You'll find others arising from things like MRI scanning. My own preoccupations when I was teaching philosophy of mind were on questions like, as Mina has indicated, free will, action, visual consciousness, the relationship between mind and brain. So as I began to think about the possibility that the human brain, or some human brains at least, might have the capacity for separate intelligences, separate presences within them, which may have been the kinds of things that people have experienced when they thought they were being spoken to by angels or gods or their invisible friends. As I started to think about that as a possibility, it led me to question a number of things about that I'd assumed as well, I guess, in relation to human mentality and psychology. I mean, one, for example, would be the idea of unity. So underlying the sort of psychotherapeutic idea that it would be for the best, where people are hearing voices, for them gradually to realise it's just them talking to themselves, and to own the voices and to take responsibility for the voices. That has an idea underlying it that hearing voices is kind of mentally disunited, right? Not say to be aware of your own thoughts, of your own inner speech as your own, is more united. And mental and conscious unity, and the extension of, let's say, self-consciousness. We become more and more conscious of what's going on in our heads, is, I guess, assumed to be a positive thing within psychology. But again, I found myself thinking, well, obviously, unity is important in certain respects in relation to psychology. Continuity of character, ability to figure things out, ability to remember, all of these things require, some kind of organisational unity, but they don't all involve the same kind of organisational unity. And when psychotherapists and psychiatrists talk about unity as a goal, I mean, Carl Jung talks about unity, mental unity as a kind of goal of maturity. I think, well, what's meant here by mental unity? What kind of mental unity is being looked for? And actually, might it be the case that a certain amount of mental disunity ought to be recognised as either a part of human mentality or a possibility for human mentality. Sorry, I've just lost my place. Another reason, for being doubtful about the idea of mental unity is that one of the key ideas that's developed over the last 50 or so years in relation to our understanding of mind is that it's to some extent modular, which means that it has different parts which have evolved at different times, and they don't all talk to each other. People have the idea that the mind is a completely interconnected, very complicated thing, but very completely interconnected. The evidence is against. The evidence appears to be that the mind is the brain is a kind of a collection of different sub-organs, some of which communicate with each other, some of which don't, depending on what they do. So again, this notion of that mental unity is some sort of sign of mental health and something to aim for in therapy. That seemed to me to be questionable when I started to think about this idea that perhaps the human brain has a capacity for separate intelligence. Another source for that idea, again, comes from, I'll just mention James. Our speaking, our speech, our open speech, not our mental speech, is all controlled apparently on the left hemisphere of the brain. There is a corresponding couple of speech areas on the right hemisphere of the brain, but they don't control our speech. And James made the guess from that the inner voices that he claims everybody heard in the past came from the right hemisphere speech centre rather than the left hemisphere speech centre. Well, just to stop briefly, how am I doing for time, by the way? Yeah. Maybe another time. Right, okay. Yeah, sorry. A further point about the left and right hemispheres. Everybody's kind of familiar with the idea of suddenly the solution to a problem popping into your head. Might not have happened to everybody, but you'll have heard of it. Or, I don't know, the way forward suddenly revealing itself, you know, when you wake up in the morning. In cases like that, it's clear that you know, the solution that's come to you isn't something that you've sat out and worked out bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And that fact reflects, apparently, a difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And you'll hear, and it's a very, you know, popular notion that, you know, that some people are more left-brained than right-brained. The difference between the two, apparently, being that the left brain is analytic, logical, rational, whereas the right brain views things holistically, as a whole, takes things in all at once. Certainly, the thought is that a lot of our creative processes, where we're not, so to speak, consciously involved, where we're asleep or our minds are on other things and so forth, is being processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. Well, I wouldn't want to overdo that. You know, some people talk about, you know, the two hemispheres having different personalities, if they've been separated and so forth. Nevertheless, what I would want to suggest is that there does seem to be, you know, two ways they get categorised in this way that we have working things out. You know, one is the one I've just associated with the left hemisphere of the brain of analysis, reasoning things through, working things out. And the others, whatever goes on the right hemisphere, which isn't so clear. I didn't mention, of course, that they're both responsible for controlling the body. The right hemisphere controls the left part of the body. The left controls the right. The point, I think, about the way that things suddenly occur to us, or we suddenly, you know, wake up to an idea and so forth because something's been going on in the background in the right hemisphere, is one reason, I think, for suggesting, well, not everything that we do is done by the self. People have all kinds of notions of what the self means. It's not a clearly defined term, but for me, the way I would think of self is broadly this. Self is the you that's got to get up in the morning, that's got to do things, that's got to tell people things, that's got obligations, that's got things to do, that's got to plan, and so on and so forth. And there are, you know, we imagine various neural structures that deal with all of that. So, if in addition to all of that, there are unconscious processes going on in the right hemisphere, it seems to me a possibility at least worth investigating, that when people hear voices and they're not aware of themselves speaking, and they're actually listening to what the voices are saying to them, then there's a good case for not simply assuming that because this is coming within your brain, it's yourself talking to yourself. But in fact, it's another part of your brain talking to yourself. And that's the part of my research that's where I'm arguing it out with psychological assumptions in psychology and therapy in relation to voice hearing. What of it? I'll try and bring what I was going to say at the end. I'll try and shorten it as best I can. What of it? Well, as I've said, I mean, my main thrust in the research that I'm doing is working out arguments for research to be, undertaken in psychology and cognitive disciplines into the possibility that in some cases of voice hearing, the voice is coming from another part of the brain, and it's saying something intelligible. That's the main thrust of the research in respect of psychology. But what then? I mean, what if it were to be, established that we have something like inner presences, inner intelligences. Maybe not everybody. Maybe everybody might have that as a possibility. In relation to the possibility of transformative change in mind, I think, well, if it's right that self-consciousness is a fairly recent historical phenomenon, perhaps human mentality could change again. Perhaps we need not, future humans need not view the world in the self-conscious way that we do. There's all kinds of literature in philosophy, psychology, religion, and so on and so forth that indicates that there are problems with our experience, that it's alienated, for example, that it isolates us. It's said in different ways by different people, but I'm going to pick on Jean-Paul Sartre as the person who kind of most pithily expresses this in his little book, Existentialism and Humanism. And Sartre says about self-consciousness, Sartre thinks that self-consciousness is a kind of mode of being. And says it's a very difficult mode of being because following, as he says, the death of God, he takes Nietzsche's idea that God died, by which he doesn't mean that literally God died. What it means is that the role that God could play in the past in human thinking, human morality, and so forth, according to Nietzsche, was no longer possible, for rational, enlightened people. And Sartre agreed with that, and he said, well, the consequence of that is that it's all up to you as an individual consciousness. Whatever's right, whatever's wrong, can only be what you decide to judge to be right or wrong. And Sartre characterises that state of consciousness as one involving abandonment, because it's lost the authority, the divine authority that you know, the former belief in God had. And it's one involving anguish, because you never know that you've no way of knowing, really, at the end of the day, that you've done the right thing, that you've made the right choice. All you can do is make it. Sartre thinks that that's a very uncomfortable state of being, which most of us get around most of the time by hiding, ignoring it, by finding ways of concealing it from ourselves, which Sartre calls bad faith. And what I would say how I would say the notion that there could be a part of the brain that's an inner presence that could communicate meaningfully with other parts of the brain, such as yourself, could advise you, could support you, that might be going on in a way already, but you don't hear it. That possibility exists. Suggests to me that Sartre's idea that human conscious mentality has to have this sort of cut off, kind of isolated, individual, burdened with responsibility. The notion that there are other parts of the brain, other intelligences than the self within, points at the possibility, I guess, that the Sartre's idea of what it's like to be a human, conscious individual needn't always be the case. Minds might change in such a way, if it were to be the case, as I say, that some inner voices really are separate from the self, that there's some substance to that. If that turned out to be the case, then it seems to me possible also to imagine that there might in future be changes in human mentality that might reflect that might not have us think all the time in terms of ourselves as individuals, having to decide everything, rationally on our own. We might begin to think of ourselves within as, I don't know, more than one. I think that's probably about the best way I could put it, and I'll not drag it on any longer than that final piece of speculation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Kevin. So I expect you probably haven't heard in our Royal Institute of Philosophy talks that some of you have attended before, anything as provocative as this, in some ways, Kevin. So, as always, if people want to make comments or questions, so we have one already. Yes, John.
one possibility that you haven't talked about is the notion that an inner voice might be a form of internal dramaturgy, and that the interior voice is a form of invoicing, a form of ventriloquism and projection. Now, this would then turn consciousness into some kind of theatre. Now, there are many philosophers, I'm thinking of Daniel Dennett in particular, who said something quite similar. Now, his model of consciousness as theatre is based upon a quasi-neurological, dispersive and vectoral account of consciousness. If this is true, and there's good neurological evidence in supporting that, then the inner voice becomes a kind of internal drama. And some of Dennett's work on vectoral and dispersive consciousness has also played into related accounts of multiple personality disorder, which then takes us full circle back to your conclusions. And I have to go and get through. But there's, I think it's, and you mentioned Sartre. Now Sartre's understanding of consciousness is also strongly attached to a notion of theatre.
Just briefly, I mean, a dramaturgical dialogue between two inner voices is that's something I do. I'd guess most people do it. You know, they play out conversations. What I would have said if I'd thought at the time, or what I'm going to say to it, you know, when I see him next time, and so on and so forth. I mean, those dialogues are a big part, I think, of mental life.
But these are not, the point I'm making is that you suggested that these interior voices are external voices. I would say they're not external voices, they're throne voices. They're interior voices of the throne that ventriloquize.
I'm just not sure how that would work, so to speak, inside. I mean, I get the idea of, you know, throwing a voice such that, you know, if I could do it, I could make it seem as if Alan was speaking my words, because he's over there. How I would, in the same way, throw my voice inside, I'm not sure. I mean,
Nor am I, but I'm just throwing it out as a...
Okay.
Don't worry, I'm not encroaching on your territory.
Feel free to do so, but...
Starting with Sartre, I'm more of a Charles Taylor man than a Sartre man, so I take the criticism that's the point that the kind of thrones itself kind of completely takes the individual consciousness and the individual personality of society in an important way. And that's what I wanted to kind of get you to say a little bit about, because consciousness it isn't, it seems to me, just the property of the self. Because it's not necessarily formed in through the self. And the voices that are talking to themselves inside, you know, one of them must speak on behalf of the collective to other people, you know, and through a language which is not developed solely independently independent of society by the people speaking. So it seems to be consciousness. The selves that are embedded in the consciousness are neither the sole property of the person who owns them, as it were, speaks on their behalf, but are also partly property of the collective in which the person is embedded. And particularly, you know, in around issues of responsibility and holding people to account and so forth. You of the unity of consciousness that you're kind of trying to challenge, which I think was really interesting. Also has implications then for holding that person to account for their actions in a social context.
Right.
And I kind of thought, as a materialist, that's something you know, because you seem to be holding materialism just about the brain, you know, and I think that the material world itself is part of the shaping of consciousness.
I'll come back on one part of that. I'm glad you mentioned Heidegger, because I forgot to mention him in relation to Sartre and Heidegger's notion of fallenness. The human experience, the Dasein experience of this world is that we're thrown into it, right? That our experience of it is alien. And that's, you know, very much Sartre's kind of view of it. So coming back to the right hemisphere and what you were saying about consciousness, another book that I'd recommend, certainly the first half of it anyway, would be Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which is about, he's a neurosurgeon, about the left and the right hemispheres and the difference between them. And the first part of his book is looking at the effects of lesions and damage to different parts of the two hemispheres, which reveals that, you know, the kind of differences in function between them. But certainly one of the things he says is that they have different roles, the left and right hemisphere, in processing experience. So in relation to, say, visual experience, there's a lot of things there's a lot that has to go on in your brain, you know, for you to take in any kind of visual scene. You've got to see, you know, you've got to be able to see things as objects, as having mass, as standing in relation to each other, you know, sort of patterns of light, so on and so forth. And apparently, the part of the role of the right hemisphere is kind of gauging the mass of things in relation to each other. But another thing that McGilchrist says about the right hemisphere, and again, you know, I think this comes from his work just studying damage to the left and right hemisphere, is that the right hemisphere in relation to experience doesn't really have a self. It doesn't really experience, you know, the right hemisphere part of experience just experiences the world. It's just in touch with the world. So he wants to suggest that you know, the self is very much, you know, a part of the left hemisphere role in processing experience. I'd probably add to that as well that you know, the notion of self has a certain amount to do with language and naming as well. But certainly, yeah, consciousness, I wouldn't say is united. I think John was right on that, and you as well.
Oh,
yes.
no, I totally accept the argument of the internal kind of refighting of battles. You know, I think that's absolutely that's a good example. It wasn't Heidegger, by the way. It was Charles Taylor and stuff.
I mean, just one point I remember that, you know, might be worth making to get the idea across. And the kind of dialogue that John just mentioned there is one that you know, you can have in your head. As I say, I do. And you know, you can imagine other people speaking in your head, you know. I don't know, you can have fun, you know, replaying their funny voices and so on and so forth. In all of those cases, to come back to it, it seems to me, you don't need to listen to know that you're impersonating John or Mina, or imagining a dialogue between them. You don't need to do that. People who hear voices, at least some of them, have to listen to what's being said and have no experience of themselves as speaking. Now, that's not decisive, but I think, the point's worth making. Also, that in among the considerable material there is on people's accounts of what voices have said to them, but particularly religious ones, they say things that in some cases that you couldn't imagine that the person it's being said to saying themselves. One example, Jane, this is an example taken from James talking about the Bible. God said to Abraham, gather your family, your chattels, your oxen, your tribe, and travel to a land hundreds of miles from here, and I will build a great nation on you. Now, Jane said, plausibly, well, that's his inner voice, that's his bicameral telling him what to do. Somebody saying something like that doesn't sound like the kind of thing that a person would just say to themselves mentally. What would be the point of that? And so there are a lot of examples of the things the voices have said being, quite different, in terms of what they want, what they seem to reveal of their personality characteristics, than the person that's hearing them.
Yes?
Hi, Kevin. I completely subscribe to this model of the evolved or developing mind or brain. And I want to pick up Heidegger's notion of the sign and fit it into Taylor's frameworks, that come out of the sources of the self. And because we are essentially thrown into a set of moral, cultural, societal frameworks within which we have to locate and develop ourselves. And I haven't read James, but referring to that, to classicism, there is a major leap that took place around that time. And that is none other than the leap from my Platonic idealism onto Aristotelian empiricism. And what does that do is places a massive shift in the way that we position ourselves in society. Because idealism is all about finding your place in life. Empiricism is about creating your place in life. Now that brings in perhaps Sartre's Lacanian issues of the other, voices of the other. So you might be thinking in a new Aristotelian way, this is what I want to do, but you have the idealist voices telling you this is what you should be doing. Right? Now that happened again, and that can actually put in place certain developmental materialist functions in the brain that develop it and push it to certain ways of thinking that is variable. Some people have stronger voices, other people have dramaturgical conversations with themselves, others have certain debates. That can vary. So I'm not keen on classifying any as mental conditions, that need treatment. That happens again in Enlightenment, right? Critical thinking, again, empirical over idealist. That happens again at the height of the emergence of modernism, Nietzsche, death of God. And that happens again in Sartre's time, May 68, and the height of the Cold War. So I'm tempted to think that we do find ourselves in key moments in time, collectively and individually, based on our own experiences, that we have certain ideals or clashing with experiences that we're confronted with.
Right.
That could be voices talking.
And again, I'm not sure I can come back on all of that. Relation to Plato and Aristotle, they're somewhat later than Sappho, and you can say that self-consciousness was pretty much galloping by the time that you know, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle had come along. I think that's part of the problem that I guess, you know, Heidegger finds with them. But certainly on one point, you know, do you accept that, you know, the ideal of what you ought to do, or what was it you said again in relation to empiricism? That empiricism.
Empiricism is more of an active being in the world.
Right.
Not subject to certain moral frameworks.
Right.
That are set either by, you know, ideals with a capital I, cosmic ideals in Plato's terms, religious ideals in Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, certain ideal frameworks which are there above and beyond us, before us and after us, that we all have to follow in a sense. Whereas empiricism, I think, is more about creating your own routes.
Okay, that's not an idea of that's not an account of empiricism that I've encountered before, but one thing I forgot to mention before in relation to James's account of the breakdown of the bicameral mind and then the emergence of self-consciousness is why he thinks that happened. Why he thinks that the bicameral mind broke down was because that kind of mind needed a kind of very kind of stratified and stable sort of society. Of the kind represented, he thinks, by the city kingdoms of you know, the Middle East in the third millennia. In the second millennia BC, things started to break down. You know, there were huge natural disasters, huge movement of people, cultures interspersing. And for that reason, James thinks, you know, there wouldn't have been any consistency in what the voices we're hearing. People would be given, you know, advice that wasn't helping them out. And he suggests, and again, he's got some, you know, evidence to support it, that people complain as time goes on of the voices of the gods going silent, the gods becoming silent. Right? And James's argument is basically because of that, people were forced to work out what to do when they had to, forced to you know, make decisions for themselves and have to think about how to make decisions for themselves. So that's so for James, the transition from, you know, between, you know, this old kind of mind to this new one is all about decision making, because in the past the voices had made the decisions and then they'd gone quiet, and that forced people to become self-conscious and you know, to learn to make decisions for themselves. And I suppose, in a way, to begin making themselves up.